The man was back, the man I'd hoped to never see again. 16 years ago, he stood on my patio, eating from my dad's ashtray, brown liquid dripping from his mouth, his eyes hidden beneath greasy hair. I was only 9, and the terror of that day has haunted me ever since. But I never expected he would return, and certainly not to find me living here, alone, in the same house. Let's rewind to that day when I was 9. I live in a terraced house, 4 houses combined, and my neighbors and I each have our own little patio. There's a small road about 10 meters from my yard where people do their Sunday walks, separated by just a small fence. My neighborhood is pretty crowded, with several of these terraced houses all around, so seeing people walking by is normal. Seeing random people standing on my patio, though, is not. When I was 9, I would usually get home from school about an hour before my mom got back from work. We lived maybe 50 meters from my school, so my mom figured I was mature enough to be home alone for a while. I did my usual routine, lock the front door, double-check the back door that leads to the patio, and then rush upstairs to my room to play as much PlayStation as possible before my mom came home and made me do homework. One day, while I was lost in a game, I heard this noise coming from outside my window. My room was located 1 floor above the patio, with a view of the road out front. It was kinda like the sound of a cat, but my cat had been missing for over 3 months. Hope sparked, and I thought, OMG, did he finally come back? I ran downstairs to check if it was my cat, but the sight that met me gave me goosebumps that still creep up my spine. There was a man standing on my patio. He was tall, with black hair covering half of his eyes, making him look like a male version of the girl from The Ring or something. I could hear him making high-pitched sounds, almost like a cat meowing. A brown liquid was running down from his mouth, and I saw him spitting out my dad's stomped cigarettes. He was actually eating from the ashtray. I was frozen, just staring in shock. Finally, I snapped out of it and screamed so loud that he must have heard it. But he didn't react, he just kept eating from the ashtray. I bolted upstairs, locked myself in my room, and called my mom, who then called the cops. I've never been more terrified in my life. Laying in bed, shaking under my covers, I listened to those creepy, high-pitched noises echoing from the patio below. I must have blacked out for a moment, because the next thing I remember is hearing the police arrive outside. I heard them talking to the man, saying things like, "What are you doing? Come here, or we'll come down and arrest you," and so on. He didn't respond, but the high-pitched noises grew louder and more frequent. I peeked through the window, feeling safe now that the cops were here. 2 officers were standing by my fence, a man and a woman, but I couldn't see the creepy guy because he was directly below me, out of my view. The police jumped the fence, and suddenly, the guy let out the loudest, most bone-chilling scream I'd ever heard. He charged at the female officer with full force and knocked her out cold. The male officer immediately tossed him, sending him shaking to the ground, still screaming. He struggled to keep the man down while putting on the handcuffs, but eventually managed. After a while, he helped the female officer up. She looked hurt, and the male officer called for backup and an ambulance. Then he noticed me watching from my window. He looked up, shook his head, and said, "I sure as hell hope you didn't see all that." I burst into tears. Neighbors started gathering, and one of them, an elderly woman, brought me down and looked after me until my mom got home. Police took the man away but promised they'd come back later to explain what had happened. That evening, the male officer returned and sat down with me and my mom. He explained that the man on my patio was diagnosed with severe autism and had escaped from a facility about 5 kilometers from our house. He told us the man had actually lived in our house 5 years before, but he'd been forced to move when his mother, his only caretaker, had died. The poor guy probably thought he'd find his mom here. He missed his routine, and he missed living here with her. I remember telling the officer, still terrified, that he had to make sure this would never happen again. He promised it wouldn't. After a few sleepless nights, life returned to normal. Years passed, and I never saw him again until 1 year ago. By then, my parents had moved out, and I'd bought the house from them. I still live here today. I was having my morning coffee on the patio when I saw a man standing on the road by my fence, staring at me. I gave him a polite nod, but then I heard the high-pitched noises. Holy shit, it's him. His hair had turned gray, but those sounds made it unmistakable. My heart started racing as memories of that terrifying day flooded back. But because I was an adult now, something in me felt differently. I realized how sorry I felt for him. 16 years later, and he was back, searching for his mom. I carefully asked if he wanted to come down to the patio. Without hesitation, he jumped the fence. I braced myself, half expecting him to knock me out like he did to the officer, but he didn't. He smiled. He looked at me and smiled. I offered him a seat, but he didn't respond. I asked if he wanted to come inside. He started laughing. We went inside. His face lit up with pure joy. He was home. It reminded him of his life with his mom, and it almost brought me to tears. Suddenly, he sat down on my couch, turned on my TV, and switched directly to the cartoons. I watched him for a while, completely focused on the screen, and I just wanted him to enjoy the moment. So I didn't say anything. After a while, I knew I had to call the facility to let them know he was here. Caretakers arrived about 10 minutes later. After a lot of convincing, he got up, crying, and went back with them. I called the facility 2 days later, and we made a deal. His name is Tom, and I now consider him my friend. Every Sunday since that day, Tom and his caretakers visit me to watch cartoons. They say it's the highlight of his week, and it makes my heart warm. For years, I thought, let's not meet, guy on my patio eating from the ashtray. Now, my thoughts are, let's meet every Sunday to watch cartoons, my friend Tom.